So this week we are having a heavy focus on certain ways the United States is not the greatest country in the world, which is, something we've been hearing in our political spheres and our news media sources, probably since you were a child. I know that has been true for me. There's a big emphasis on the United States being the best, the biggest, the strongest, all in this name of patriotism. And, while it's helpful to feel prideful about where one comes from, and it's helpful to feel connected to common geographical locations, you can work with the people who live in your area, it also can reach a point of unhelpfulness when we end up kind of covering up all the ways that, no one space is the best anything in the world. So, to end and sort of build us a pathway forward, I wanted to have y'all read a little excerpt from this book, Walk Out, Walk On. So I was introduced to this book a couple years ago, and it is sort of a book that talks about the what next. And it takes an international focus on this topic of when something is not working and people start to see that it's not working, what happens? What happens when people start to walk out of the thing that is not working? So the book gets its name from a scenario in India where school children were not satisfied with the education they were receiving, or rather what they weren't receiving for education. So they decided instead of dropouts, they were going to be walkouts and make a statement in terms of, we are not the ones failing here. Society is the one failing here. We're gonna exit and take our energy away from this scenario. Figure out something different, something better. So this is where things can get challenging, especially when we're, talking about a country like the United States, where our systems and processes, it's true for any country, right? Systems and processes get really entrenched. Ours in particular is pretty steeped in historical injustice, as we know and are learning. So it's a challenge to think about what comes next. We're going to be returning to some of the content from Walk Out, Walk On in future weeks, more towards the end of the semester. But I wanted to offer sort of some real world scenarios about what walking out to walk on to something different can look like. So I'm going to use myself as a personal example. So last August, I left Omaha and have been traveling since. I'm temporarily back in Omaha recording this right now, but I'll be traveling again soon. So it has been a year of a lot of change, a lot of experience, a lot of expansion, and a lot of walking out. I actually filmed a version of this a year ago in August of 2020. Now it's August 2021. So I'm going to intersperse some clips of my thoughts on walking out at that period in time. This is actually a natural building, so it's created, I'll move a little bit so you can see a little bit more of it. It's created using something called straw building. Essentially, it's layering, I guess, I'm still learning the lingo too, but essentially stacks of straw, layering them with clay and mixing them with some other sort of adhesive liquid. And you can end up creating something like what you see behind me. So this is actually like a fireplace. It actually goes down into a bedroom area behind me as well. And they do have electricity in here too. So, it's a little rustic, it's a little rugged. Let me see if I can show you the ceiling part of it. You can see the ceiling is all wood and kind of pieced together, and there's some pretty little hand carved designs on the backs. So I'm coming to you from this building today for a reason, and in week 2 content for another reason. So in week 2, we're doing some readings and we're intaking some information, some sort of, I would say, difficult truths about the United States. One of the things about this country is that patriotism and individualism are very sort of deep intrinsic values to American culture. And how that manifests in some ways is through an education system that doesn't always teach us the truth about our history as a country or our current status in the world. We hear the phrase America is the greatest country in the world again and again and again in this country, especially when it comes to the arena of politics. And yet when we ask ourselves, what constitutes the best country in the world? What makes something the best? we get into a deeper set of questions that, based on some of the statistics that we're reading about this week, I think, can call into question whether the United States is the best country in the world, and where that slogan even comes from, and what do we mean when we say things like that. So all of this to say, we're reading these difficult truths. One of the last readings of the week is one I want to talk about in particular, which is from an excerpt of the book Walk On, or Walk Out, Walk On. But essentially that book is about leaving systems behind that aren't working. And we have a tough time doing that in the United States. A lot of the systems we still have in operation are systems that were created and continue to operate in many of the same ways that they were originally created within decades and centuries ago. And so one of the things that I think in the United States and in our culture in particular we struggle with is this notion of letting go, of walking out of the things that are no longer working and walking into something different. So I chose to film from this building because to me this is an example of a sort of living real life version of a walk out, walk on sort of situation. Honestly, that's a little bit, not even a little bit, honestly, that's a lot of what I personally have decided to do over these last few months of leaving behind, walking out of things that I'm seeing that aren't working so well anymore, and trying to walk on to something different. So, doing something like creating buildings from straw and the raw materials we have around us is a novel concept in a lot of ways. Of course, this is something that if you trace back through history, ancient cultures, of course, did this as well. And yet we've been raised in this modern culture to have this mentality that somehow new is better, and that the current ways of building with steel and cement are somehow better, safer, more secure, etc. Whereas there are whole cultures, whole populations of people who are striving to reinvigorate some of the things from the past that did work. So the location that we're staying at is actually known for natural building in this sort of way. They offer education on it. They have written some books about it. And one of the things they really hope to do is sort of reinvigorate this notion of natural building, this notion of using the Earth's natural resources to create something like this beautiful building I'm filming from within, instead of repeating things that aren't working. Because the reality of using things like steel and cement, it's harsher on our environment. And if we look around at some of the natural crises, the natural disasters that we are currently experiencing as a global population, again, we can start to ask ourselves questions about why are we seeing some of the environmental consequences we're currently seeing? And some of that is due to the ways that we as a society have been socialized and trained to believe are the best. So this week 2 content is really sort of about pulling together some of those threads and just making some points about areas within the United States that we really need to rethink. Are we the best? Is this really working? And if it's not working, why are we continuing to do it? And again, all of that has been part of my drive to pursue this new, vastly different lifestyle change, to learn about some of the ancient ways of doing things, to think about how could we walk out of some of the things that aren't working within social service systems, in addition to building systems, and instead walk on to something different, walk on to something more humane, more human, and that serves everybody involved a little bit better. Okay, but let's backtrack a little bit. So when you think of walking out, I want you to think about this in terms of your own life too. Like, we've all had scenarios that we've decided, like, okay, that's enough of this. This isn't working for me anymore. I need to change, and I'm gonna go exit this scenario, do something else, whether that was any kind of relationship, a previous job, etc. Like, I think about it in terms of my professional background is child welfare, and there was one organization I worked for in particular that started to kind of like increasingly place higher and higher burdens of expectations on the direct service workers who were in that organization. So, people were already struggling. Child welfare a decade ago when I was there was hard to work for a sustainable amount of time in a lot of different roles. Maybe that's changed, maybe that's not changed. So there was already, a lot of stress and people feeling like they didn't have enough hours in the day to do everything that was required of them, especially in terms of the paperwork on top of meeting clients' actual needs. And the expectations just sort of kept building from this organization. And there was one moment in particular where they announced that they had an expectation that if you were hired as a full-time employee, you were not hired for, a 40-hour work week. As a full-time employee, you were expected to work more than 40 hours. Like 40 was not what you were hired to do. You were hired to do more than 40. And there was no cap that was given, just a general expectation. That's a sort of scenario where I walked out of that scenario. A lot of other folks walked out of that scenario. Maybe you've had a scenario like that where there was a situation that felt really unjust. It felt unjust to have the policy changed like that when, 40-hour work week is not always enforced, especially in different disciplines. But it's a boundary, right? Like it's a boundary. And so that's an example of how walking out might happen when there is an injustice, when somebody's boundaries are being violated and they decide to go and seek something else. On a more recent note, I recently walked out of academia. So I was a full-time faculty member for 4 years at UNO in the School of Social Work Department. I have been in school forever as a child, of course, and then I have a bachelor's degree. I have a double master's degree. I spent 3 years in a PhD program at UNL. So I was really embedded in academia. And this specifically was a time period when I was teaching full-time and working on my PhD at the same time. And I was starting to experience those same sorts of scenarios where I was being called to do things that didn't align with things that to me felt right. They didn't align with values, they didn't align with boundaries that I had, such as my PhD program wanting me to quit my full-time job so that I could be a full-time PhD student. So it was a little bit of that. It was also a matter of injustice and oppression. So as I was teaching and as I was a student, I was both having expectations that felt unfair placed upon me, that scenario and other scenarios too, and I was seeing how that was playing out for my student population. I was starting to question Western models of education. I was seeing that, someone like me could push through the 40-hour work week plus the homework assignments that I was having to do that sometimes took hours for me to figure out, especially when I was in the statistical classes, leaving me essentially no time for self-care, for free time, for anything like that. That was possible for me, and it was really, really, really hard. And I don't have children. I have financial resources. I have a support system. I don't face a lot of the burdens that other students, not just burdens, but life circumstances that other students do. As I'm thinking about this with the social work program, we have this, in addition to coursework requirement, we have requirements surrounding practicum experience, which are generally unpaid. So there are other layers in terms of who are we setting up for success and who are we setting up for failure. I also was able to excel in academia because I was prepared for that throughout my education when I was a child and in high school. The high school I went to was very focused on preparing us for college standards, preparing us to be able to talk academically, to be able to cite sources, to be able to read research articles and analyze what people are saying and think critically about the messages that are being communicated. That is a very privileged experience in education in the United States. That's another layer of, was it possible for me to succeed in academia? Yes. And who is it not possible for? Who is it less possible for? Not that it's not possible for anyone. Anything is possible for everyone. It's just, again, we have to look at some of those patterns in terms of when we see graduation rates, when we see race, gender, class, socioeconomic status breakdowns in terms of students who were in higher education. And I was also seeing the impacts on my students in real life. I was teaching 4 classes, so I saw a lot of students. I met every single bachelor's student who came through our program during that time period. They had me in one of many classes usually. And so I saw a lot of scenarios where students who had marginalized identities, or students who were care providers for children or for other people, or students who were in poverty, were struggling at significantly higher rates than, of course, students who weren't facing those experiences, who didn't have those experiences. So I was watching the injustice play out. I was witnessing the toll on mental health that education took, not just for students who face challenges. I mean, we all face challenges again, but for everybody. I was watching people's mental health deteriorate as a result of the expectations that were placed on them through education. And it got me questioning about if education is something we can be creative with, if we can think beyond the narrow ways that we've been taught to believe a classroom looks, that we've been taught to believe learning looks, which very commonly is a teacher in front of a classroom giving a lecture for a couple hours, and you go and read a textbook, and then you write a paper, and the teacher tells you whether it's good enough or not. Scientifically speaking, that is not an effective way that people learn, and yet that is a very common practice. So I was seeing the ineffectiveness of that approach, and I was also seeing the consequences of having and holding really high, rigorous academic standards over students' heads. And when we question, where do high, rigorous academic standards come from? Where do paradigms and belief systems that this way of speaking, this way of talking, this way of writing, this way of expressing yourself is good, and this way of speaking, this way of talking, this way of expressing yourself is bad? Like, where do those paradigms come from? We can trace them back to the origins of this country. We can trace them back to white supremacy. We can trace them back to white settler colonization that embedded certain values that we continue to follow today. So I started to realize this on bigger and bigger levels. It's actually a huge impetus for the reason why this class is designed that it is. And eventually got to the point I could not continue to stay and feel aligned with who I was. I had encountered too many students at that point who were experiencing mental health symptomology to the point where they were experiencing suicidal ideation. Again, not that, there were other things happening in their life as well, but school was a huge driving factor in that. The pressures that were being placed on them, the expectations of perfection, that school needed to come first, all things that I did not want to continue participating in. So another scenario of walking out to walk on is that example. Me walking out of my formal education role so I could to reimagine education a little bit, design a class like this, and have some really candid conversations that, if I had stayed in that position, might not have been as appropriate for me to be able to have. So the thing about asking the kinds of questions that we are asking and are going to continue to ask in this class is, it is like pulling a thread on a sweater. And the more you pull, the more the sweater pulls apart, the more you're curious, what is the sweater made of? What's underneath the sweater? How did it get put together in the first place? It is a continuous process of unlearning when we open to it. So I started this walkout process, sort of more professionally focused, and then it has since and continues to be a very personal experience as well. So walking out of academia for me was also walking out of professional workforce, was also walking out of ideas about hierarchy and how in this society we are often structured to, have to give our authority and our power away to a higher voice, a boss, a parent, etc. Again, it's not that that's always a bad thing or never okay. It is, everything is a balance. If you're in a situation where you're feeling like glad to have a boss right now because you're new to your role or less experienced, or you just appreciate having someone to feed off of and get guidance and advice from, maybe you have the great fortune of having an amazing boss, like all of that is totally okay. I'm not saying like ditch your day jobs and do what I did, jump in a van and go travel. Like, it doesn't have to be quite so extreme. Just for my experience and my professional and educational trajectory, this is where it has led me, is to the extremes of walking out. So walking out on professionalism, meaning also walking out on the ways that I physically express myself. I think of somebody like Senator Ernie Chambers in Nebraska, who's been a senator for over a decade. The laws surrounding term limits were created to try and keep him out of the office in Nebraska. And one of the things that he does is he will never dress up. He will wear sweatpants and a sweatshirt to every hearing. And it's not a disrespectful thing. It's a statement on appearanceism. It's a statement on why is what I have to say dependent upon how I look. Why can't I do a video in a crop top that says the future is queer and share it with my students? Would it matter if I was wearing a suit and sitting in an office? Would you take what I'm saying right now more seriously then or not? So I'm certainly not the inventor of these concepts. I am somebody who started very much on the other side of buying into professionalism, buying into achievement. I was historically very type A and wanted all the good grades and to do all the good things and get all the praise by my bosses. So for me, it's been a journey to get to the place where my physical appearance can be something that's for me and not for other people. Walking out of cultural expectations. This past year, I have been I've been doing some other things as well, but I have been living out of a van for the last 6 months. Traveled up the coast in California in this van. Definitely an example of walking out. This is part of a much larger movement of people who are exploring nomadic lifestyles where you don't have to be as dependent on social structures in order to get your needs met. So, for example, I have my van and it was, a money investment up front, that's for sure. But I have a fridge in there, I have solar panels, I have like a battery thing that I can charge. Like, I can be self-sufficient. I can go somewhere for 2 weeks at a time period, live in the forest for 2 weeks and not have to leave. So when you think about things like cost of living, the experience of being nomadic really changes the type of work that you have to do. If I was still here in Omaha paying a mortgage, owning a house, then I would need a much higher income. Choosing to walk out of professionalism and walk on to a more nomadic lifestyle, there's certainly pros and cons. It is not an easy experience. It is not for everyone. Although I think there are a lot of ways to make it work regardless of what your preferences are, if you have some of the money to invest in something like that. So it's definitely a more extreme version of walking out. However, the cost of living becomes much more simple. Right now, for example, I am temporarily here in Nebraska and I'm renting a room in a collective house. So my monthly costs are, again, low to the point where I'm able to lead a more non-traditional lifestyle. I can adjunct teach online and have a lot of free time to be able to fill the ways that I choose to fill it. And this is a huge part of the appeal for people who are choosing nomadic lifestyles or who are choosing to live in community, people who are living communally. I spent some time with the Radical Fairies in Northern California. So that's a national and international sort of community that is queer and a little bit anarchist and like kind of a combination with like 60s love. It's like a merge of all of those things in one. And that's another example of groups coming together. And there's so many others, queer and non-queer examples of people coming together and living in community, because what does that do? It releases our level of reliance on systems. If I'm in, this house with 3 other people, my costs are low, but also the burden of cleaning, the burden of doing yard work, the burden of cooking even. Those are things that can be shared responsibilities instead of like me having to do that by myself every single day, which when I lived in a house alone for many years of my life was the case. What's interesting is I found what's in this book to be true in my own personal experiments with really walking out, not just walking out of a job I didn't like, but walking out of an entire system way of being, walking out of a lot of my former identities, walking out of what I thought the world was, walking out of what I thought my future was going to be. The walking out process is a deep process. It's not as simple as just like, again, it depends on how deeply you're taking it, but it's not as simple as just like packing a bag and going on a trip. It was a very deep process of letting go of these former versions, of walking out on these visions and belief systems, paradigms, values that had been, that I had held for a really long time that no longer aligned with who I was and who I was becoming. So this was a terrifying leap to make a year ago. And what's interesting is that I found this part of the book to be true especially. So it says, as old systems fail, a few people walk out. They walk on to experiment with new ways of thinking and organizing that enable them to find solutions to seemingly unsolvable problems, such as the problem of capitalism. How do you reduce dependence upon a system that is built to profit from us? You can work communally. You can find other creative ways of living non-traditional lifestyles. At first, they feel isolated and alone, limited in what they can achieve. They often don't realize there are other walkouts. Walk-ons find each other and connect. Together they learn quickly, take greater risks, and support one another to continue their pioneering work. A new system is born from their efforts. So, when I left, felt super alone, felt super terrifying. I left with somebody. I was traveling with my former partner at the time, so I wasn't completely isolated, and yet it felt like a really isolating thing to do because I was taking a huge leap that nobody I knew in real life had ever taken before. So it absolutely felt isolating. What was true on the other side is along that journey, I met a lot of other different types of walk-outers who were walking on to some various aspect of what I was hoping to walk on to as well, which is ultimately a more liberated way of living, a way of being able to do the work that I feel called to do that doesn't also have me harming or participating in harm of other people. Finding creative ways of learning how to do that. That's the walk out, walk on process. And what I found was communities of people who were thinking about the same things, who were envisioning living differently. And this isn't something that we know or hear a lot about here in Nebraska. That does not mean that it's not happening. So in any way that we want to apply this concept of walk out, whether it's as small as leaving small, right? Like, those are major things too, leaving a relationship, leaving a job, leaving a situation that isn't working. Those are major, big things too. And we can take a walkout scenario a lot further by walking out on the concept of gender, walking out on the idea of what a romantic relationship has to look like, walking out on, again, these values and concepts and ways that we've been taught to think about ourselves and other people that as we grow and learn and evolve and expand ourselves, like, no longer fit. I have walked out on the idea of people who are assigned female at birth needing to be hairless. So I'm no longer shaving, but it's part of this bigger process of walking out of systems and ways of being that are not in alignment with who I am and who I want to be. So as you're thinking of all the various ways that you have walked out in your life, like, give yourself credit for those, celebrate those. And I also present this as a challenge for all of us to think about, what are the things that we need to keep walking out of? What is incongruent with who you are right now? What would it look like to start to walk out of that? To me, it was like smaller steps, cutting off my hair, getting visible tattoos, presenting myself a different way physically, gave me the power and the confidence to show up and present in a different way, emotionally, mentally, verbally, etc. So it can be big things, it can be little things. I just encourage you to think about what are the areas of life that you feel called to walk out of. What are the things that you see about the ways our culture works, the way our society works, that aren't in line with who you are? And what are some of the steps that you might be able to just even start thinking about? Nobody needs to rush into anything here. My process has been happening for like 5 years. So it doesn't have to be something you do right now. It's a seed you can plant inside your heart, inside your mind, inside wherever, and just see what happens when you allow that seed to bloom.